A heavy silence draped over the temple of Delphi, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, weighted with mysteries yet to unfold. Inside, a few priests stood quietly, each casting quick glances toward the oracle seated on her high stone throne. Her eyes were unfocused, her body tense as if caught between two worlds, her spirit reaching beyond the veil of mortal sight, and to realms where even the gods spoke only in shadows and symbols. As she breathed in the sacred fumes that spiraled up from the earth's depths, her form swayed with the whispers of prophecy. The priests could feel it, something powerful was stirring. A vision was unfurling before her, each thread pulling tighter with a sense of urgency that made the air in the room quiver. Those who had witnessed her in the throes of prophecy knew when a vision held weight, and this one felt like the heartbeat of something immense, something inevitable. Suddenly, the oracle's voice cut through the stillness, low and raw, a trembling murmur that sent chills down the priests' spines. Her words carried the weight of destiny. A god is coming, but he is like no other. The priests exchanged uneasy glances. A new god? There was no room for another on Olympus. The existing pantheon was powerful and complete. Any new addition would disrupt the fragile balance. But they dared not question what the oracle saw. She was the mouthpiece of the fates, the bridge between the mortal and divine, and what she spoke would come to pass, whether they wished it or not. Her voice rose, filling the temple with a strange resonance. This god will be born of fire and sorrow. He will walk the path of mortals and drink from their joys and griefs. And yet, he will wear the blood of the immortals. A murmur ran through the priests, their faces a tapestry of wonder and fear. The gods of Olympus ruled with power and precision, each embodying their own divine domain. But here was a god that sounded different, someone who would not simply watch over mortals, but somehow walk beside them, someone who would taste their struggles and share in their triumphs. The concept was bewildering, yet deeply thrilling. But there was more. The oracle's gaze sharpened as if piercing into a future only she could see, her voice hushed yet powerful. He will be born twice, from flesh and flame. He will carry the joy and the madness of all beings, mortal and divine. He will dance on the edge of reason, a flame in the night, guiding the lost and reveling with the found. He will bring joy to the sorrowful, and madness to the content. A shudder passed through the priests as her words sank in, each one chilling and burning, settling in their hearts like a prophecy of both hope and doom. This god would not fit into their world quietly. He would challenge everything they knew, blending light and darkness, joy and chaos, blurring the lines they had thought unbreakable. Outside the temple, a soft breeze stirred, carrying the faintest hint of something wild, like the scent of crushed grapes and distant laughter, a promise of revelries under starlit skies. The priests could almost feel it, an untamed energy just beyond their grasp, a sense that something was awakening. The gods were proud, often unyielding, but this god, this twice-born, would bring change like the rolling of a storm, breaking the chains of convention and bridging the chasm between the gods and the mortals. The oracle's voice softened, her tone almost a whisper, her eyes distant. The world will tremble beneath his step, yet his hands will soothe the broken-hearted. He will be loved and feared, celebrated and scorned. This god will not only rule from above, he will dwell in the hearts of men. The idea felt like a spark igniting within the priests' minds. A god who would walk among mortals, a god who would carry both joy and sorrow in equal measure. He would be unpredictable, unbound, a force that would dance beyond their understanding. His laughter would echo in every corner of the earth, his tears watering the roots of the vine. He would be a god of wine and wildness, of ecstatic release and devastating fury. One of the younger priests, unable to contain himself, finally spoke in a quivering voice. "What will he be called?" The oracle's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, her gaze seeming to drift even further, reaching for something distant, almost out of reach. "He will be Dionysus, the twice-born. And his name shall be both song and scream." A silence fell again in the temple, thick and heavy with meaning. The priests could feel the shift, as if the world had just turned slightly on its axis, marking a new path, a different future. Whispers traveled quickly, out of the temple and down through the streets, until even the gods, high on Olympus, began to sense the ripples. There was talk, quiet yet urgent, of this new god, a strange one who would be neither fully of Olympus nor entirely of the earth. His presence was as certain as it was elusive, a thread of divine madness woven into the fabric of the mortal world. Above, in the lofty heights of Olympus, some of the gods caught wind of the prophecy, and they, too, felt a flicker of curiosity, a tiny tremor of apprehension. Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, listened with narrowed eyes as the tale reached her ears. She sensed, with an almost instinctual dread, that this child, born of fire and sorrow, would carry something of Zeus's nature, something dangerous and unpredictable. Zeus himself sat silently, a strange light in his gaze, a mix of anticipation and resolve. He knew well what this prophecy could mean, for him, for the Olympian order, and for the mortals below. There was an unspoken understanding between him and the oracle. They both knew that what was coming could not be stopped. The twice-born god was meant to be. A breeze swept through the palace of Thebes one warm evening, carrying with it the faint scent of summer flowers. Semele, the young and radiant princess, stood by her balcony, staring up at the stars that twinkled like scattered jewels across the deep blue sky. She didn't know why, but lately, the stars felt closer, almost watching her, filling her with a strange, unnameable longing. There was something electric in the air, something that whispered of promises yet unspoken, desires yet to be understood. And on this night, the quiet held an intensity, a thrill that made her pulse quicken. Then, as if answering the silent call of her heart, a shimmering figure appeared in the shadows of her chamber. Zeus, king of the gods, stood before her, cloaked in the guise of a stranger. He watched her with eyes that held the depth of oceans, his gaze powerful yet soft, drawing her in as though he had always known her. There was an unearthly glow about him, something that made her feel both safe and electrified, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, just a step away from flying. For a moment, neither spoke. Time itself seemed to hesitate, stretched thin by the thrill that vibrated between them. Semele's heart pounded, her breath shallow, as she struggled to comprehend this stranger's intense beauty. His eyes, wise beyond any mortal's, studied her with a kindness she had never seen before. And in that gaze, she felt seen, understood in a way she hadn't even understood herself. Zeus took a step closer, his voice like distant thunder softened by a summer rain. Semele, he murmured, her name like a caress, filling her with warmth. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch gentle but electric, as if her skin were made of lightning. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling, caught somewhere between curiosity and awe. "A friend," he replied, the corners of his mouth curving into a gentle smile. "A friend who has watched over you from afar." The words filled her with a strange comfort, though her heart still raced. The familiarity in his voice, the gentleness of his touch, it all felt like a song half remembered, a melody that had played in her soul long before she could put a name to it. And so, night after night, Zeus came to her in the quiet hours, when the palace lay still and the world was cloaked in darkness. Each meeting was like a dream, rich with secrets, filled with whispered words and laughter that only they could share. Together, they wove their own world, a space where time held no meaning, where nothing mattered but the spark that connected them, a flame that seemed to grow brighter with every stolen moment. Zeus never revealed his true identity, knowing well the dangers that lurked in Hera's jealous heart. He was the king of the gods, but even he could not escape the gaze of his divine wife. Yet each night, drawn to Semele by a force stronger than fear or reason, he risked it all, concealing his divinity with every visit, covering his light in the cloak of secrecy. With every meeting, their connection grew, deeper and more intense, like a river swelling after a storm. Zeus felt his own heart soften, a tenderness emerging that he hadn't known he could feel. Semele's laughter, her innocence, her bright curiosity, they captivated him, filling him with a warmth that even the heavens had never given him. For Semele, these nights were both her dream and her secret. She found herself waiting each day for the dusk, her pulse racing at the thought of his arrival, of the gentle touch and whispered words that left her yearning long after he was gone. She had loved, or thought she had, before, but this felt different, as if she had found the missing part of her own soul. One night, In a moment when the world seemed to fade around them, she turned to him, her eyes full of an emotion too powerful to name. "Why must you leave before dawn?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Stay, just once, stay until the sun rises." Zeus felt the weight of her words, the desire woven through them. He wished he could stay, wished he could reveal himself to her fully, to let her see him in his true form, but he knew the cost of such a wish. To show her his divine self would mean risking everything. The gods were not like mortals, their power was as dangerous as it was beautiful. But in that moment, watching her, he felt a pull so fierce that he almost told her the truth. Instead, he cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek as he whispered, "There are things, dear Semele, that you cannot yet understand." His voice was soft, almost pleading. "But know this, I will always come to you, even if I cannot stay." The words both soothed and wounded her, leaving her yearning for something she couldn't name. Yet she nodded, trusting him, allowing herself to be held in the mystery of his presence, content to hold onto the dream he offered, even if it meant living in the shadow of dawn. But elsewhere, far above the earth, eyes watched with an intensity sharpened by suspicion. Hera, queen of Olympus, had begun to sense something amiss, her heart cold with the familiar sting of betrayal. Zeus had been distracted, disappearing during the night, his mind somewhere beyond the golden halls of Olympus. Though he tried to mask it, Hera knew her husband's habits, knew too well the subtle shifts in his gaze, the way he seemed to drift away. And she could feel it, a connection, one that he was guarding carefully, a love forbidden and fragile, a bond that spoke of a threat to her power. Zeus, lost in the warmth of his forbidden love, did not yet see the storm gathering on the horizon. For now, he had Semele, and in those stolen moments, he allowed himself to forget the weight of Olympus, the constant watch of his queen. All that existed was the mortal woman before him, the joy in her eyes, the way her smile lit up his world as if he were discovering the beauty of life for the first time. Semele's heart, too, began to swell with a love that felt like a secret flame, hidden yet bright, consuming her every thought, filling her days with dreams and her nights with longing. She felt alive, caught in a feverish enchantment that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. And though she did not know his true name, her soul recognized him, held onto him as though he were the only truth she had ever known. Yet a shadow lingered at the edges, a flicker of fear that neither could fully shake. Both Zeus and Semele could sense it, the quiet threat in the air, the delicate balance they were tiptoeing on, each night drawn closer to the edge. They did not speak of it, did not allow words to disturb the fragile bliss they had found. For now, they clung to each moment, ignoring the silent warnings, allowing their hearts to soar in the forbidden space they had carved out, a sanctuary hidden from the world, held only by their love. But far away, the queen of Olympus held her silence, her gaze sharp and unyielding, her wrath gathering like a storm just waiting to break. The palace of Olympus was silent, wrapped in a stillness so intense it felt as if the very clouds held their breath. Hera, queen of the gods, sat alone, her heart tightening with a familiar ache, a feeling that mingled anger and sorrow so deeply it left her breathless. The whispers had finally reached her ears. Whispers that Zeus, her husband, her king, had found another. Once more, he had given his love to someone else, and this time, to a mortal. The name haunted her, Semele. A name as fragile as the girl herself, a princess of Thebes, young and foolish enough to believe in a love that could defy the wrath of a goddess. Hera's mind twisted with images of Semele, basking in the attention of Zeus, lost in the lies he must have spun around her. It was not jealousy alone that stirred in Hera's heart. It was the pain of betrayal, a hurt made sharper with each repetition, yet one that had never dulled despite the years, despite her position as queen of the gods. As she sat in the empty halls of Olympus, Hera's mind raced, her thoughts weaving like threads into a dark tapestry of revenge. She had always known how to endure, how to swallow her pride for the sake of power and dignity. But this time felt different. This time, she was not only jealous, she was humiliated. Her husband had stepped down from the heights of Olympus, disguised himself, and entered the world of mortals for a woman who could never match the strength or grace of a goddess. How could he? How could he betray her like this? Hera closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, each inhale fueling the storm within her. She would not let this insult stand. She would teach this mortal, Semele, what it meant to take the love of a god, a love that was meant for her alone. The thought of Zeus's smile, his gentle words, directed at another woman, burned in her mind, feeding her rage. One of her most loyal spies, a shadowy figure who moved between realms unseen, entered silently, bowing his head. Hera looked at him, her gaze cold, and he began to speak in a voice as soft as a whisper. "It is true, my queen," he murmured. "Zeus visits her nightly, cloaked in secrecy. The girl knows nothing of his true identity." The words cut deeper than Hera had expected. Zeus hadn't even shown the mortal his true form. He was hiding, deceiving the girl, protecting her from the very wrath that now surged through Hera's veins. But Hera was not just any goddess, she was the queen of Olympus. She would not allow herself to be scorned. "Tell me everything," she commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. Her eyes glittered with a fierce intensity, and the spy dared not hold anything back. He described each encounter, each stolen kiss and whispered word, the way Zeus looked at the mortal with tenderness that was meant for her, for his queen. Each detail felt like another twist of the knife. When the spy had finished, Hera sat silently, the calm before the storm. Her mind was already plotting, devising ways to bring her revenge to life. She would not confront Zeus directly, no, that would be too simple, too merciful. She wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal in the worst possible way. She wanted him to lose what he cherished, to watch it crumble in his hands, powerless to stop it. The mortal would pay. Semele would learn what it meant to capture the heart of a god, to believe herself worthy of a place in his world. Hera's lips curled into a cold smile. If the girl loved Zeus as deeply as the spy suggested, she would use that love against her. She would let Semele's own longing be her undoing, a desire that would lead her into a trap so carefully woven she'd never see it coming. Summoning a few trusted confidants from among the lesser gods and spirits who owed her allegiance, Hera began to lay out her plan. She would disguise herself, slipping down to the world of mortals just as Zeus had, appearing before Semele as a friend, a guide. She would plant the seed of doubt, stoke the fire of curiosity. Mortals were easy to manipulate, especially when they believed themselves in love. She pictured the moment when Semele would fall into the trap, her heart blinded by trust and hope. The girl would ask Zeus to reveal himself fully, to show her the god he truly was, not the gentleman who came to her cloaked in mystery. And when Zeus revealed his full divine form, it would be too much for a mortal to bear. Semele would perish, consumed by the very love she had thought would save her. Hera's heart pounded, her fury and pain mingling into something fierce, something unstoppable. She knew the risks. Zeus would be devastated by the loss, perhaps even enraged. But he had brought this upon himself, choosing to place his love in the hands of a mere mortal. Hera's wrath was no longer just a reaction, it was a judgment, a declaration of her power, a reminder of her place as queen. For now, she would wait. She would let Zeus continue his nightly visits, let him fill Semele's head with dreams and promises, let him believe he had found happiness in his forbidden love. And when the moment was right, when Semele's heart was so full of love it was ready to burst, Hera would strike. The other gods watched in silence, sensing the storm that loomed around their queen. They knew better than to cross her path, to question her actions. Hera's anger was as ancient as Olympus itself, her pain etched into the very stones of her throne. They had seen her suffer, seen her forgive only to be betrayed once more, and they knew the depths of her patience, and her fury. A hush fell over Olympus as Hera rose, her mind set, her spirit sharpened. She moved with the grace of a predator, a lioness defending her territory, her pride. And as she gazed out over the clouds, she allowed herself one last, bitter smile. She would reclaim what was hers, not with brute force, but with the skill of a master weaver, a hunter who knew how to strike her prey at its weakest. Tonight, the stars twinkled coldly above, unblinking, unfeeling, as Hera prepared to descend from Olympus, her heart set on a path that would leave both the heavens and the earth trembling. An old woman, bent with age and draped in simple, worn robes, shuffled through the streets of Thebes. Her hair was streaked with white, her eyes shadowed by the weight of years. She seemed like any other nursemaid, someone forgotten by time, invisible in her quietness. No one gave her a second glance as she made her way to the palace gates, her face lined with wrinkles, a gentle smile resting on her lips. Inside the palace, Semele sat alone in her chambers, lost in thought. She could still feel the warmth of his embrace, still hear the softness of his voice murmuring her name like a secret held just for her. Yet there was a part of her that trembled with uncertainty, a faint doubt that pricked at her heart. She could feel the weight of it, like a shadow lurking at the edges of her love. The man who visited her each night seemed almost too good to be true. He was gentle, loving, attentive, but he always kept a part of himself hidden, cloaked in mystery, slipping away before dawn. As she sat there, the faint shuffle of footsteps approached her door, and she looked up to see a nursemaid entering with a slow, careful step. The woman bowed her head, her smile warm and inviting. "Pardon me, my lady," she said, her voice quivering with age but laced with kindness. "I did not mean to intrude. I am simply an old woman with many stories, and I heard you might enjoy some company." Semele felt a soft affection for the old woman immediately. There was something familiar in her gaze, a kindness that seemed to understand the quiet sorrow buried within her heart. She invited the woman to sit, and soon they fell into conversation, sharing tales of childhood dreams and lost loves. The woman spoke with such warmth that Semele felt her heart begin to lighten, her laughter spilling out like sunlight. In time, their talk drifted to love, to the tender mysteries and hidden fears that lie within it. The woman sighed, a long and weary sound, her eyes filled with something dark and knowing. "Ah, love is indeed a gift," she murmured, "but a gift that requires trust. Trust, my dear, is the foundation of any true bond." Semele nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle within her. Yet the weight of her doubt seemed to grow, a shadow flickering across her mind. She had never dared to ask her lover about his secrets, had never pushed him for answers he was reluctant to give. But now, with this wise woman by her side, she felt her heart stir with questions that had always been kept silent. "It is strange," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "He comes to me every night, and yet I feel there is something he hides. He is gentle, caring, yet I do not even know who he truly is. Sometimes, I wonder if he is even real." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Love is a beautiful thing, my dear," she replied softly, "but it should not be shrouded in mystery. Do you truly know this man who visits you, or is he simply a vision, a dream? If his love for you is real, would he not show himself as he truly is?" Semele's heart twisted, uncertainty rippling through her. The words struck her deeply, stirring the doubts she had tried so hard to ignore. She longed to see her lover without the cloak of secrecy that surrounded him, to know him as he was, not as he chose to appear. "Sometimes," the woman continued, her voice soft and full of sympathy, "we must seek the truth, even if it is painful. For without truth, love is but an illusion." She paused, her wrinkled hand reaching out to clasp Semele's. "If he truly loves you, he will show himself to you. If he truly cares, he will reveal his heart, as bare as yours." The words echoed in Semele's mind, filling her with a strange mixture of courage and dread. She could feel the weight of her love pressing against the walls of her doubt, a force so powerful it left her breathless. She wanted to believe in him, to believe that their love was strong enough to withstand any truth, any revelation. But a part of her feared that her heart was woven from dreams, fragile and easily broken. "But what if he is hiding because he fears what I might see?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if he does not trust me enough to reveal his true self?" The woman leaned closer, her eyes glinting with a hidden fire. "Then it is your right to know, to see him as he is," she replied, her tone steely. "No love can survive in the dark. Demand the truth, my dear. And if he truly loves you, he will give it." The advice felt like a spark igniting within Semele. She had been patient, trusting in his love, content with the secrecy that surrounded their meetings. But now, a fierce resolve stirred in her. She wanted more than shadows and whispers. She wanted to see him, to know him as he was. Her heart beat with a mix of fear and anticipation as she decided, finally, to ask him to reveal himself. As the old woman left, Semele stood alone in her chamber, her mind alive with the possibilities of what lay ahead. She felt as if she had crossed a threshold, as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. There was no turning back now, no unthinking the thoughts that had been planted in her heart. Far above, Hera watched as her plan took root, a cold satisfaction filling her heart. She had planted the seed, stoked the flame of doubt, and now, she would wait, letting the mortal's own love be her undoing. The night was silent, with only the faint rustling of leaves as Semele waited, her heart racing. She had decided. The questions, the lingering doubts, had grown into a desperate need. She could no longer live with the shadows that wrapped around her lover like a veil. Tonight, she would see him as he truly was, or she would see him no more. The air grew heavy, a warm, electric charge filling the room, and in an instant, he was there, her love, her mystery, the man she knew yet didn't know at all. His face was gentle, his smile warm as he reached for her, but tonight, there was a distance in her gaze that startled him. He felt it before she even spoke, something had shifted. "Zeus," she whispered, and her voice wavered. "I need to ask something of you." His eyes softened, but there was a flicker of concern in them, a warning, almost as if he already knew the question in her heart. "Ask me anything," he said softly, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. She took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of her request. "I want to see you as you truly are," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to see your true form." He froze, the light in his eyes dimming, replaced by a deep sorrow that made her heart ache. "Semele," he began slowly, "my love, you do not understand what you're asking." A sudden desperation gripped her. "But I do," she cried, clutching his hand tightly. "How can I love you completely when I don't even know who you are? When I only see a shadow of the truth? How can there be love if there is no truth?" His face, so calm, so certain, was now etched with lines of fear and grief. He pulled her close, as if trying to shield her from herself, from the storm she was summoning. "My true form, Semele, is not meant for mortal eyes. It's more than you can bear." But she shook her head, her resolve unwavering. "Then let me bear it. If you love me as I love you, let me see the truth." Zeus held her gaze, the silence stretching between them, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the heavens. He could feel the weight of her insistence pressing upon him, her love demanding a sacrifice he dreaded to make. And yet, her determination was unbreakable. He knew she would not rest until her wish was granted. Finally, he sighed, his voice breaking. "I have warned you. But if this is what you truly desire, I will not deny you." A flicker of fear crossed her face, but she held her ground, heart pounding, eyes unblinking. She watched as he stepped back, his gaze never leaving her, a final silent plea in his eyes. She met his gaze steadily, and with one last, shuddering breath, he began to reveal himself. The transformation began slowly. His mortal guise melted away, and a brightness began to emerge from within him, like the dawn breaking across a darkened sky. The room filled with a light so pure, so brilliant, that it hurt to look at, but Semele did not turn away. She watched as the man she loved faded, replaced by something vast, something ancient, a being forged from lightning, from storms, from the very fabric of the heavens. The light grew brighter, more intense, and a sudden, unbearable heat filled the room, wrapping around her like fire. Her heart pounded with terror, yet she stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to look away. She saw stars swirling within his form, the infinite power that lay hidden behind his gentle eyes. This was Zeus, the true god of thunder, of sky and storm. But as the light intensified, as it became blinding, searing, she felt her skin begin to burn, a pain unlike anything she had ever known. She gasped, her eyes widening in horror as the truth dawned upon her. This was not a light for mortal eyes, this was not a power meant for flesh and bone. She cried out, her voice swallowed by the brilliance, her hands reaching for him even as her skin blistered, her body consumed by the force she had begged to see. Zeus's face twisted in agony as he reached for her, but it was too late. She was surrounded, swallowed by his radiance, by the intensity of his unshielded form. From Olympus, the gods watched in silence, their faces grim as the tragedy unfolded below them. They saw the moment her body faltered, her mortal form unable to withstand the force of a god. Her cries grew softer, her figure fading like a shadow against the light, until finally, she was gone. The room fell silent, empty, save for Zeus, who stood alone, the last traces of his godly form fading, leaving him once more as a man. But Semele was gone, her presence lingering like a phantom, her voice echoing in his memory. He fell to his knees, a grief as vast as his power sweeping over him, knowing that the woman he loved had perished by his own hand. Far above, Hera watched, her heart cold with satisfaction, but even she could not escape a twinge of sorrow at the scene before her. Her revenge had been wrought, her wrath appeased, yet in that moment, even she felt the weight of loss that had descended upon the heavens. The stars above flickered, dimmed, as Zeus cradled the last memory of Semele in his heart, the woman who had loved him enough to see him as he truly was, yet could never survive the truth. The room was a barren, scorched silence. Ashes lay where Semele had once stood, scattered and still warm, the last fragile remnants of her life. Zeus knelt amidst them, grief hanging over him like a storm. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to touch the air where she had been, and felt only the emptiness left behind. His heart, so accustomed to bearing the weight of gods and storms, was shattering, broken by a love that now lingered only in memory. Then, just as the grief threatened to consume him entirely, a faint warmth pulsed in the ashes. A heartbeat. He felt it, a tiny spark, weak but alive, buried within the dust and remnants. He held his breath, frozen by hope and dread in equal measure. He reached down, hands shaking as he sifted through the remnants until his fingers brushed against something soft, something impossibly alive. It was the unborn child, his child, the last gift Semele had left him. The faintest flicker of life pulsed beneath his fingers, like a flame in a storm. He stared in wonder, the enormity of the moment washing over him. Here, in his hands, was the future they had dreamed of, the life that had survived even death itself. But the child was fragile, its pulse weak and fading. Time was slipping away, and he knew that without immediate action, this spark, too, would vanish into the ashes. With a surge of determination, he made a choice, one so strange, so desperate, that only a god could have dared it. He could not lose this child, could not let Semele's last gift disappear. There was no cradle strong enough for a god's son born of mortal flesh, there was no place safe enough to shield him. So, Zeus turned to the only vessel he trusted to hold such precious, fragile life, his own flesh. With a single, decisive motion, Zeus took a sharp blade and made an incision in his thigh. His immortal flesh parted, and though he felt pain, he did not flinch. With infinite care, he placed the embryo within the wound, sewing it into the flesh of his leg, merging his blood with the tiny heartbeat he was determined to protect. His body would serve as a shield, a cradle, to hold the child safe. The fates watched, their ageless eyes wide with awe. This was a sight even they had never foreseen, a bond forged from love and desperation, a child born from ashes and sewn into the flesh of a god. They whispered among themselves, their voices threads in the loom of destiny. The twice-born, they murmured, weaving the title into the tapestry of his life. A child of fire and storm, born of loss and love, marked by fate to bridge two worlds. Time passed slowly, marked by the pulse of the life within him. Zeus carried this hidden child with him, his steps heavy with both grief and hope. He could feel the heartbeat growing stronger, the tiny presence sheltered within him. Every beat, every flicker of life, was a reminder of Semele, of her love and the sacrifice she had made. Finally, when the time was right, he felt the child stir, as though ready to greet the world that awaited him. He made his way to a quiet place, where the skies were open and the stars watched in silence, and with careful hands, he began to bring his son into the world. The child emerged not from a mother's womb but from a god's flesh, cradled in the essence of immortality, surrounded by the warmth of divine love. And there, beneath the starlit sky, Zeus held his son for the first time, his heart overwhelmed by a mixture of pride, sorrow, and awe. This was Dionysus, the twice-born, a child forged from tragedy and hope, a child who had defied the very bounds of mortality to live. The gods themselves looked on, their hearts touched by the sight of a life born so uniquely, a soul carried through fire and grief yet bound for greatness. Zeus, king of the gods, stood in the shadow of Mount Olympus, cradling his newborn son close to his chest. The child stirred softly, his small hands gripping Zeus's fingers with surprising strength, and a warmth spread through Zeus's heart that he had not felt in eons. This child, his child with simile, had survived against all odds, survived fire, survived the raw power of Zeus's own form. But now came a new battle, one against eyes that watched from every corner of Olympus. As he held Dionysus, Zeus knew what this child represented. Dionysus was not just a son, he was a symbol of a love that had defied mortality, an impossible life forged from loss and rebirth. But his birth was wrapped in secrets and shadows, and Zeus understood with cold clarity that to keep him safe, he would have to hide him, even from those who would be his family. One by one, the gods gathered, summoned by Zeus to a silent, moonlit council. Each face was cast in half-light, Hermes with his quick, darting gaze, Athena with eyes that searched for truth, and Apollo's soft but curious stare. They knew something extraordinary had happened, sensed it in the air, but they had not yet heard the words Zeus was about to speak. "I have brought forth a child," Zeus announced, his voice as unyielding as stone, yet edged with a fierce protectiveness. "His name is Dionysus, and he is my son." A ripple of surprise moved through the gods. They exchanged glances, wary and uncertain. A son born of a mortal woman, a child who bore both divine and mortal blood, was almost unheard of among them. There was a silence, a palpable tension, as the weight of his announcement settled. Then Zeus raised his hand, demanding their attention, and his eyes darkened with a warning. "This child is under my protection," he continued, his voice low, yet filled with a gravity that silenced every murmur. "No word of his birth, his lineage, or his survival will leave this circle. Dionysus must remain hidden, a secret among us. Swear to me." One by one, the gods nodded, their faces somber. They felt the depth of Zeus's command, the lines he was drawing to keep his son safe from forces that would not understand, forces that would seek to tear him from this fragile world he had just entered. Each god placed a hand over their heart, a silent vow binding them to Zeus's will. Yet, even in that silence, Hera's gaze was unyielding, her eyes narrowed as she regarded Zeus with a look of suspicion and something darker, an old wound reopened, a reminder of promises broken and vows discarded. She knew her husband too well to miss the depth of his protectiveness, the way he guarded this child's life with a fierceness that went beyond duty. She watched the small bundle in his arms, and though she said nothing, her silence was colder than any accusation. Zeus met her gaze, his own expression veiled, but beneath his calm exterior, he felt a flicker of dread. Hera's wrath was not a force to be taken lightly, and he knew the cost of her jealousy. Yet, he would not yield, not when his son's life was at stake. The council dissolved into the night, each god vanishing into the stars, their oaths like whispers scattered on the wind. Zeus was left alone, a solitary figure beneath the vast sky, with only his son cradled in his arms. He held Dionysus close, feeling the rise and fall of the child's tiny breaths, and for a moment, he let himself hope. Perhaps, if they were careful, if they were vigilant, his son could live free from fear, from the threats that loomed over them like shadows. But the gods were not the only ones who would watch, and Hera's suspicions grew sharper with each passing day. She moved through Olympus with a silent resolve, her questions subtle yet piercing, her eyes seeking answers in every corner. She knew her husband had hidden something, and though she had sworn to keep the child's existence a secret, her heart simmered with a dark and unyielding curiosity. The heavens held their breath as the moment came. Zeus stood at the edge of the world, his chest rising and falling, his heart pounding with anticipation. The air around him shimmered with divine energy, thick and electric. His hand pressed firmly against his thigh, where the child, his son, had grown for months, safe within him, hidden from the prying eyes of Olympus. Now, the time had come. With a sudden, sharp movement, Zeus ripped the seams of his immortal flesh. There was no pain in this act, only the cool certainty of destiny. He felt the stirring within him, the tiny life that had been nourished and protected by the divine essence of his body. And then, as if the very fabric of the universe exhaled in unison, the child was born. A small, fragile form emerged into the world, slick and new, and for a brief moment, Zeus could not speak, could not move. His heart swelled in a way he had never felt before. This was his son, this was Dionysus. He had not been born in a normal way, not from the womb of a mother, but from the flesh of a god. He was a being caught between two worlds, a child who was part divine, part mortal, the echo of something both sacred and forbidden. The baby wailed, a cry that was both fragile and full of raw life. Zeus's hands trembled as he held him for the first time, his breath catching in his throat. The child was so small, so delicate, yet his eyes, when they finally opened, burned with an ancient wisdom, a depth that no infant should have. The deep, dark eyes of Dionysus met his, and Zeus saw the future unfold within them, a future that would be both beautiful and tragic, bright and dark, a future that would bridge two worlds and leave its mark on the heavens. "You're free now," Zeus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of the world seemed to rest in his arms, yet he would do everything to protect this fragile, precious life. As Zeus gazed down at his son, something stirred in the air. A soft, quick movement behind him, and then Hermes was there, stepping forward with a look of quiet resolve. The swift messenger of the gods, always on the move, always alert, was now tasked with the most important mission of all, to guard this child, to keep him safe from the dangers that would surely come. Hermes' gaze softened as he looked at the newborn god. "I'll protect him," he said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty that hung in the air. "He will grow in the shadows, but I'll be there to guide him." Zeus nodded, grateful for Hermes' unwavering loyalty. There was no doubt in his mind that Dionysus needed protection, not only from the dangers of the world, but from the gods themselves, some of whom would never understand his existence, his strange dual nature. He was a god, yes, but something more, something mortal as well. The balance would be fragile, and it was only with great care that he could survive. The gods had whispered among themselves, each of them sensing the arrival of the child, yet none dared speak of him aloud. He was too unusual, too different from any other divine being. The fates, who wove the threads of destiny, had already begun to take note, but what they saw in Dionysus was not written in simple strokes. His life would be unpredictable, marked by joy and sorrow, laughter and tears, and above all, transformation. Zeus pressed a kiss to the infant's forehead, feeling the warmth of his son's skin against his lips. He had promised Semele he would protect their child, and now he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. "Your future will be unlike any other," Zeus whispered softly. "You are born to lead, to change, to bring both freedom and chaos. You will change the hearts of gods and mortals alike. But you will never be like them. You will be more." As the night deepened and the stars blinked in silent witness, Hermes carefully took the child from Zeus's arms, cradling him gently. The baby's cry softened, his tiny hands curling around Hermes' fingers. The god of travelers looked at Zeus, his expression full of determination. "I'll take him away, to where no one can find him. He will grow up hidden, away from Hera's wrath and the dangers that wait for him. But he will grow strong, in his own time." Zeus's heart clenched as he watched his son disappear into the shadows with Hermes. He knew that Dionysus would never be truly safe. The gods were cunning, and Hera's jealousy would never fade. But for now, for this one moment, the child was safe, and that was enough. The silence that followed was deep and filled with the weight of both hope and sorrow. Zeus had given life to a new god, one who would shape the world in ways none of them could yet imagine. Dionysus would not be a typical god, and the world would never be the same again. He was born not from a mortal womb, but from fire and divine will, a child destined for greatness yet haunted by the fragility of his origin. As Zeus stood alone beneath the stars, he could not shake the feeling that the birth of Dionysus was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything. And though he knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, he also knew that this child, this god, would be something the world had never seen before. He would grow, he would change, and in the end, he would become something more than anyone could ever have imagined. The morning sky above Mount Olympus crackled with an unnerving stillness. The air felt thick with tension, as though the gods themselves held their breath. Hera, the queen of the gods, stood on the edge of her balcony, staring out into the distance. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, had grown cold and sharp with suspicion. The whispers had reached her, the rumors that her husband had betrayed her once again, this time with a mortal woman, creating a child that should never have been. A child who defied the laws of nature. Hera clenched her fists, the knuckles white with anger. The flames of betrayal burned in her chest, but they were nothing compared to the cold, calculating fury that rose within her. She would not let this child, this symbol of her husband's infidelity, live. It was a threat to her power, a reminder of Zeus's unfaithfulness that could not be allowed to survive. She turned, her cloak swirling around her like a storm, and summoned the Titans. Ancient and powerful, the Titans had once ruled the world, but they were now bound by Zeus's might, exiled to the depths of the earth. But Hera's voice held the weight of authority, and they answered her call, emerging from their dark prisons to serve her will once more. "You will find the child," Hera commanded, her voice like the crack of thunder. "You will destroy him before he has a chance to grow. He is a threat, and he must not live." The Titans, with their vast power and ancient strength, nodded in grim agreement. They would obey Hera's command, for their hatred of Zeus ran deep, and they had long waited for an opportunity to strike at his heart. This child, a son of Zeus, would be the perfect place to begin. Meanwhile, far from the grasp of Olympus, in the quiet sanctity of a hidden grove, Dionysus lay in a cradle made of soft leaves, his tiny body wrapped in the warmth of divine protection. He was unaware of the danger that was swiftly approaching. His eyes were still closed, his tiny chest rising and falling with each gentle breath, his face peaceful and innocent. He was safe, for now. But the world outside was changing. The Titans, their massive forms casting long shadows across the earth, moved swiftly and silently toward the mountain where the child had been hidden. Their eyes burned with the fury of their queen, and their footsteps shook the ground beneath them. They would not stop until the child was destroyed. It was Hermes, the swift messenger, who sensed the danger first. His instincts, sharp and ever alert, had been honed by countless years of service to the gods. As he flew over the landscape, his wings beating faster than the wind, he felt the disturbance in the air, a growing darkness, a surge of anger and malice. Hera's wrath had finally found its target, and the Titans were coming for Dionysus. In a flash, Hermes changed direction, his form a blur as he raced toward the grove. He could not allow this to happen. Not after everything that had been sacrificed to keep the child safe. Dionysus was not just a son of Zeus, he was a symbol of something more, something that could change the very fabric of the gods. He had to be protected, no matter the cost. As Hermes reached the grove, he saw the Titans coming closer, their massive figures silhouetted against the darkening sky. Their faces were grim, their eyes set on the infant with unrelenting purpose. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Hermes landed softly beside Dionysus, his heart racing. The Titans were moments away from striking. He reached down and gently picked up the child, cradling him in his arms with surprising tenderness. Dionysus stirred slightly, his tiny hands reaching for the safety of Hermes' cloak, but he remained asleep, unaware of the danger. Hermes looked over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon for the oncoming threat. The Titans were nearly there, their shadows long and heavy. He knew he could not fight them directly, he was too fast, too clever for such confrontation. But he had something far more important than brute strength. He had the favor of the gods and the speed of the wind. Without a moment's hesitation, Hermes spread his wings wide. With a powerful thrust, he took to the skies, soaring high above the grove and away from the Titans. The wind whipped around him, the air rushing past him as he held Dionysus close to his chest. The child was safe for now, but the danger was far from over. Below, the Titans watched in fury as the small, winged god flew away, their eyes filled with rage. But they could not catch him. Hermes was the fastest of the gods, and with Dionysus in his arms, he was untouchable. He had no intention of allowing Hera's vendetta to destroy this child. The Titans roared in frustration, their massive forms fading into the distance as Hermes disappeared into the clouds, the sound of their fury echoing through the mountains. When Hermes finally landed, it was on the slopes of Mount Nysa, a place untouched by the wrath of the gods, hidden deep within the forest where only nymphs and spirits resided. The nymphs, who had long served the gods with their quiet grace, took one look at the child and knew he was special. They would protect him with everything they had. Hermes carefully placed Dionysus into the arms of the nymphs, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of his flight. "You must keep him safe," he said, his voice urgent. "Hera will stop at nothing to see him destroyed. Keep him hidden, keep him protected." The nymphs nodded, their expressions filled with a solemn understanding. They could sense the power that emanated from the child, even as he slept in their arms. He was not an ordinary infant. He was something more, a divine spark that had been born in fire and blood. As Hermes took flight once more, disappearing into the distance, the nymphs swore an oath to protect Dionysus with their lives. And as the Titans' footsteps faded from the mountainside, they knew they had just witnessed the beginning of something far greater than any of them could imagine. Dionysus would grow up in the shadows, his safety ensured by the nymphs of Mount Nysa. But the storm of gods and Titans was far from over, and the child's journey had only just begun. In the heart of a secluded, lush valley, far from the reach of gods and Titans, the world moved at a rhythm all its own. The sun filtered through thick canopies of ancient trees, casting golden beams across the soft earth below. The air was rich with the scent of wildflowers and pine, and the symphony of nature played constantly, chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the whisper of water running over smooth stones. Here, amidst the gentle embrace of nature, Dionysus grew. He was just a child, but even in his infancy, there was something undeniably different about him. His eyes, large and dark, sparkled with a curiosity and wonder that was beyond his years. He looked up at the world around him with an intensity that seemed to demand answers, a hunger for life that could not be ignored. And the nymphs, those ethereal creatures of the forest, watched over him with tenderness and care, knowing that this child, though small, was destined for something far greater than any mortal or god could predict. The nymphs, who were as much a part of the earth as the trees and the streams, had long known the ways of the world. They had seen seasons come and go, watched over countless creatures, and shared in the endless beauty of the wild. They had never expected to care for a godchild, but when Hermes had entrusted Dionysus to their care, they had accepted him as their own. The child was a gift, a mystery wrapped in innocence, and the nymphs loved him as they loved the forest itself. Dionysus grew quickly under their watchful eyes. His laughter echoed through the valley, pure and full of joy, as he played with the creatures of the woods. Squirrels scampered at his feet, and rabbits nuzzled his hand. His tiny fingers grasped at the vibrant leaves that danced in the wind, his feet often bare, feeling the earth beneath him as though it was his birthright. He would chase butterflies until they vanished into the sky, and then lie on the grass, staring up at the clouds with wide, wondering eyes. As he grew older, his connection to the earth deepened. The nymphs taught him to listen, to the wind that carried the songs of distant lands, to the trees that whispered stories of times long past. He learned the rhythm of the seasons, the dance of the moon and the stars, and the way the forest shifted when the rain came. But there was more to his upbringing than nature's wisdom. Dionysus found himself drawn to the wild celebrations that often bloomed naturally from the heart of the forest. One evening, as twilight fell over the valley, Dionysus stumbled upon a cluster of vines twisting their way up a stone wall. The vines, thick and heavy with ripe grapes, caught his attention. He ran his fingers across them, feeling their smooth skin, their sweet aroma filling his senses. It was a taste of something new, something sweet and intoxicating, and before he knew it, he had plucked a handful of grapes and tossed them into his mouth. The juice exploded on his tongue, rich and full of life. It was unlike anything he had ever tasted, a sensation that stirred something deep within him, a spark of joy and warmth that spread through his entire being. The nymphs, who had been watching from a distance, smiled knowingly. They had seen the signs of his affinity for the vine long before Dionysus himself had understood it. The child was part of something ancient, something that ran through the veins of the earth itself. He had tasted the fruit of the vine, and it had called to him in a way nothing else had. He laughed, a sound that was both pure and wild, and the forest seemed to respond, as though the very earth itself had recognized the child's bond with it. Over the seasons, Dionysus's love for the vine only deepened. He learned to crush the grapes with his tiny hands, pressing them into sweet nectar that would flow into his mouth in the quiet of the night. He reveled in the feeling of the juice running down his chin, the taste filling him with a sense of freedom, of life itself. It was as though the world bloomed in color when he held the wine in his hands, and he would dance beneath the stars, laughing with the wind, as though he were one with all things. The nymphs saw this with quiet joy, but also with a quiet understanding. They knew that Dionysus was not like other children, even those of the gods. He was both wild and gentle, full of light and shadow, joy and sorrow. He had within him the power to change the world, to bend it to his will, to call upon the primal forces that lay hidden in the earth. But it was in the simplicity of his laughter, his wild abandon in the face of life's pleasures, that his true nature shone. The creatures of the forest, too, seemed to recognize the child's power. Deer grazed near him without fear, and the birds perched on his shoulders, singing their songs into his ear. The very land seemed to hum with life as Dionysus ran barefoot through the meadows, his spirit as untamed as the wind itself. The nymphs, who had never known a godchild before, were in awe of his energy, his vitality, and the way he seemed to belong to the earth in a way they had never seen before. Dionysus's days were filled with joy and discovery, each moment of his childhood woven together like a dream. He would race through the forest with his nymph mothers, climb the tallest trees to reach the stars, and play in the streams until his laughter could be heard for miles. He learned to sing in the language of the trees, to play instruments made from reeds and bone, and to dance with a rhythm that came from the heartbeat of the earth itself. The joy of the world was his playground, and he reveled in every moment of it. The nights, too, were full of wonder. As the moon rose high above the valley, Dionysus would gather with the nymphs and the creatures of the forest. They would sit around a fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces, and sing songs that spoke of the land, the sky, and the deep magic that flowed through everything. The air was thick with the scent of wine, and the music would swell, filling the valley with a pulse that seemed to echo the very essence of life itself. Dionysus would laugh, his joy infectious, and the nymphs would join in, their hearts light and free. It was a world of freedom, of life in its most natural and unrestrained form. Dionysus, raised among the nymphs, was shaped by this world. He grew into a being who was part of it all, the music, the wine, the dance, the earth itself. And as the years passed, it became clear that the child who had been hidden away, the child of both gods and mortals, was destined to bring forth a new age, an age where the wild joy of life would reign. But that time was yet to come, and for now, Dionysus lived in the blissful simplicity of his childhood, surrounded by the love of the nymphs and the creatures of the forest. The world outside might have been unaware of him, but here, in this sacred place, Dionysus was free, and his heart was light. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm amber glow across the valley. Dionysus, now a young child full of wild energy, sat beneath the canopy of the great oak tree, his fingers trailing through the lush vines that covered the ground. The forest around him was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant creatures, and the soft, rhythmic hum of life. But today, something was different. Today, something new was about to be discovered. As he reached out to touch the thick, dark clusters of grapes hanging from the vine, he couldn't help but marvel at their deep purple color. He had seen them before, of course, tasted them in passing. But today, as he pulled a handful free from the vine, something tugged at him, something that felt like a calling, a whisper in his heart urging him to explore further. He held the grapes in his hands, studying them with curiosity. He had learned from the nymphs that the world was full of hidden wonders, waiting to be uncovered. The vines had always fascinated him, the way they seemed to grow in rhythm with the land, their fruit bursting with sweetness and life. But what if there was more to these fruits than just taste? What if there was something deeper, something magical within them? Without thinking, Dionysus began to crush the grapes between his hands, the juice spilling out in streams of rich, dark liquid. The scent filled the air, sweet and intoxicating, making him dizzy with delight. It was a fragrance unlike anything he had ever encountered before, something that seemed to dance in the very air itself. The juice dripped into the soft earth beneath him, and he watched with growing fascination. What would happen if he left it there? Would it change? Would it become something new? He left the crushed grapes on the ground and ran off to play, forgetting about them for the moment. But when he returned later that day, he noticed something strange. The liquid, which had once been fresh and vibrant, had begun to change. It had darkened, thickened, and now it seemed to bubble ever so slightly, as if it was alive in some mysterious way. Dionysus bent down and touched the liquid with a finger, his eyes wide with wonder. He brought it to his lips, tasting it cautiously. The sensation that swept over him was instant. The warmth spread from his tongue to his chest, and a sudden, unfamiliar joy flooded his body. It was as if the very essence of the earth had entered him, filling him with a lightness he had never known. His laughter rang out, echoing through the trees, as his mind swirled with a sense of euphoria. He felt alive in a way he hadn't before, his limbs light, his heart beating with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the forest itself. For a moment, Dionysus could hardly believe what he had discovered. The grapes, crushed and left to ferment, had become something magical. It was as though the land had given him a gift, one that could bring joy, energy, and life to anyone who drank it. The power of the earth, the sweetness of the vines, had been transformed into something far greater than mere fruit. It was a drink, a potion, something that could stir the soul. As the night fell and the moon rose high, Dionysus couldn't contain his excitement. He ran to the nymphs, his feet barely touching the ground as he excitedly waved his arms. They gathered around him, their faces full of curiosity, and Dionysus eagerly told them what he had discovered. His voice trembled with the thrill of it, and his eyes shone with the joy of someone who had found something truly extraordinary. The nymphs were skeptical at first, but when they tasted the fermented drink, their expressions changed. At first, they were cautious, their delicate mouths tasting the liquid with hesitation. But soon, their eyes widened in surprise. Then, one by one, they broke into delighted laughter. The music of the forest seemed to come alive around them, as the trees swayed and the creatures of the forest gathered in closer. The air was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of the wine, and the valley seemed to hum with an energy all its own. The animals of the forest, too, were drawn to the strange drink. A group of deer cautiously stepped closer, their soft hooves barely making a sound on the forest floor. One of the young ones took a tentative sip from the pool of liquid Dionysus had left behind, and then, as if it had discovered a secret, the rest of the herd followed suit. The deer nuzzled each other, their movements becoming more fluid, more graceful, as if the wine had brought them closer to the magic of the earth itself. In the distance, the wolves howled, their calls rising and falling like the notes of a song. The wild creatures of the forest were not immune to the power of the wine. Their eyes gleamed with newfound energy, their movements more spirited, as if they had been touched by some ancient force. It was as though the entire forest had become one with the magic Dionysus had stumbled upon, a connection to the earth itself that was both primal and pure. As the night wore on, the energy of the valley seemed to build, as if every living thing had been caught in the rhythm of the wine. The nymphs danced around Dionysus, their movements as fluid as the streams that ran through the forest. They laughed and sang, their voices blending with the music of the night. Dionysus watched them, feeling a deep sense of connection to all that surrounded him, the land, the creatures, the nymphs. They were all part of this magical, joyous dance. He had not meant to create something so powerful. It had simply happened, an accident born from his curiosity and the wild, untamed spirit of the forest. But as he watched the joy spread through the valley, he realized that he had discovered something that could change the world. The vines, the grapes, the earth, these things were all alive with magic, and he had tapped into it. He had found the key to a power that could bring people together, lift their spirits, and remind them of the simple, beautiful joy of life. And in that moment, as the stars shone above and the forest thrummed with energy, Dionysus knew that his destiny was intertwined with this drink, this wine that had the power to awaken the soul and set the heart free. He had uncovered a secret that would forever change the world, and he couldn't wait to share it with those beyond the valley. The first village Dionysus entered was small, nestled between hills where the sun shone brighter than anywhere he had ever known. It was a peaceful place, a place where the scent of wildflowers danced in the air, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the streets. Yet, there was something missing. The people moved in a steady, rhythmless way, drudging through their daily chores, never lifting their heads to the beauty around them. Their eyes were dull, their voices quiet. Dionysus, a young man with an exuberance as wild and untamed as the vines from which he came, stood at the village's edge. The weight of his divine nature seemed to press upon him with every step, but he was not here to stand apart. He was here to be with them, to share in the joy and madness of life itself. He had traveled far and wide, learning from mortals, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, and hearing the whispers of longing from human hearts. As he walked into the village, the people looked up, startled. A stranger in fine clothes, a strange light about him, there was something mesmerizing in his very presence. He was different from anyone they had ever seen. But it was not his beauty that caught their attention, it was the energy that seemed to radiate from him, an energy that felt like the earth itself had come to life. He smiled, a grin that held the promise of something wondrous, something beyond their understanding. In his hands, he carried a basket full of grapes, glistening under the afternoon sun. He spoke to the villagers, his voice full of warmth, of life, of freedom. "Come," he said, "let us celebrate. Let us break free of the chains that bind our hearts. Life is a gift, and it should be lived in full bloom." He pulled the grapes from the basket and, without hesitation, crushed them underfoot, his bare feet pressing into the soft fruit until the juice began to spill, rich and fragrant, onto the earth. A few villagers gathered hesitantly, drawn to the strange man and his strange ways. They watched as the juice began to ferment, thickening with time, until the air was filled with its sweet scent. Dionysus, with a sparkle in his eyes, handed the first cup to a villager, a man whose face had grown old with years of toil. His hands trembled as he held the cup, the dark liquid swirling inside. The man stared at it, unsure, before bringing it to his lips. And in that moment, as the wine touched his tongue, something inside him shifted. The weight of his sorrow, the years of work, the monotony of his life, all of it melted away, leaving only a sense of freedom, of lightness. He laughed, a sound that was strange to his own ears. The others watched, astonished as the man, now filled with joy, began to dance in the center of the village. The music of life seemed to swell all around them. And one by one, others stepped forward, tasting the wine. Their fears, their doubts, their burdens all melted away with each sip. The heavy, unyielding weight of their lives gave way to the power of celebration, of community, of the simple joy of being alive. As the night stretched on, Dionysus stood at the heart of it all, watching the villagers become something new. Their faces, once tired and worn, now glowed with the brightness of those who had rediscovered their own sense of joy. The old man danced with the children, his feet light and free. The women sang, their voices ringing out like birds in the dawn. Even the animals gathered around, drawn to the energy of the celebration. But it was not just the wine that had transformed them. It was Dionysus himself, his laughter, his wildness, his invitation to break free from the ordinary. He had come to teach them that life was not meant to be lived in the shadows of worry or fear. It was meant to be lived in the fullness of every moment, every breath. And as the celebration grew, so too did his understanding of the world he was meant to change. He saw the faces of those who had suffered, whose hearts had been broken, whose lives had been nothing but survival. And in their laughter, in their dancing, he saw the magic he had brought with him, the magic of release, of freedom, of joy. They were no longer slaves to their daily struggles. They were free. The night wore on, and the villagers didn't want it to end. The stars above them blinked with a quiet intensity, as if even the heavens were watching the scene below. Dionysus smiled to himself, knowing that this was only the beginning. He was not just a god among them, he was a bridge between the divine and the human, between what was known and what was yet to be discovered. The wine, the revelry, the music, they were his gifts to the world, and he would give them to anyone willing to taste the joy he had found. The next village he visited was not unlike the first. The people here, too, had been caught in the dullness of their routines. Their work had become their lives, and the weight of their burdens hung heavy in their hearts. When Dionysus entered their village, the reactions were similar: hesitation, suspicion, fear of the unknown. But he had learned the art of persuasion. He did not ask, he did not demand. He simply offered. He offered the gift of wine, of celebration, of release. And again, the transformation was swift and sure. The villagers tasted the wine and, like the others, felt something inside them shift, a lightness, a joy, a freedom they had never known before. It wasn't just the wine that was special, it was Dionysus himself. His presence was like a spark that ignited something deep inside them, a hunger for life, a longing to be more than they had ever been. And as they danced and laughed, their voices rising together in song, Dionysus knew that his gift had power. It was a power that could heal, that could bridge the gap between gods and mortals, between pain and joy, between suffering and bliss. As the days turned into weeks, Dionysus continued his travels. His influence spread across villages and towns, reaching places where the people had long since forgotten the art of living. With each village he entered, he brought with him a spark of something new, a new way to see the world, a new way to feel the world. He did not ask for followers, for worship, or for praise. He asked only that they embrace the beauty of life, to drink deeply from the cup of joy, and to never forget the power of celebration. And as the years passed, the stories of Dionysus spread. He became more than just a god. He became a symbol of everything that was untamed, everything that was wild, everything that was joyous. He bridged the gap between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human, and the world would never be the same again. Dionysus stumbled through the forest, his feet heavy, dragging through the leaves and mud. The trees, once so familiar to him, now loomed like monstrous giants, their branches twisting and reaching toward him as if to trap him in their grip. His head was clouded, thoughts swirling in a haze, like a storm that would never cease. He had been walking for hours, or was it days? Time had lost all meaning to him now. He felt a crushing emptiness, a coldness gnawing at his chest, as though something was inside him, tearing him apart. It wasn't the wine, the revelry, or the music that had once brought him such joy. No, this was something else entirely. A force beyond his control had taken hold of him, something dark and relentless. It was the same force that had torn at him since his birth, the bitter vengeance of Hera, his father's wife, who had never forgiven him for his existence. He had been her target since the very beginning. His very life had been a thorn in her side, a reminder of Zeus's betrayals, and now she had finally found a way to hurt him, to strip him of everything that had made him feel alive. In this moment, he could almost hear her cruel laughter echoing in the back of his mind, taunting him, pushing him to the edge of his sanity. The madness came in waves, crashing over him like a relentless tide. His thoughts were jumbled, memories blurred, and reality itself seemed to slip away, like smoke through his fingers. He tried to grasp onto something, anything, but it all slipped through his mind like water. His identity, his purpose, even his name seemed to fade into the distance, and all that remained was the overwhelming urge to scream, to run, to escape the pain that gnawed at his soul. But where could he go? How could he escape what had been planted so deep within him? He was a god, yes, but he was also something else, a child of a mortal and a divine being, caught between two worlds, never fully accepted by either. His heritage, once a source of pride, now felt like a curse. He was both too much and never enough, a being who didn't belong anywhere. And now, Hera's revenge had twisted his mind, driving him further away from the world he had known. As Dionysus wandered aimlessly, he came across a small group of mortals, farmers, perhaps, or travelers, walking along the path, unaware of the chaos unfolding within him. They were simple people, their lives shaped by the seasons and the earth, their faces withered and kind. They had no idea who he was, but they could see the madness in his eyes, the wildness in his movements. They stopped, unsure whether to approach him or turn away. He stumbled toward them, his voice broken and desperate. "Who am I? What am I?" His words were strangled, as though even the simple act of speaking had become impossible. He reached out toward them, but his arms were like lead, his body betraying him, twisting in unnatural ways. One of the travelers, a woman with kind eyes, stepped forward cautiously. She didn't know him, but there was something in the way he looked at her, a mix of confusion and pain, that made her heart ache. She reached out to him, her touch gentle, as though she might be touching a fragile creature. "You're lost, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice full of compassion. Dionysus nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know where I'm going. I don't know if I can find my way back." The woman's eyes softened as she touched his shoulder, her heart aching for the god who had wandered into her world, lost and broken. "It's okay. You don't have to know everything," she said, her words like a balm to his tortured soul. "Sometimes, we all lose our way." But as soon as she spoke those words, a sharp, searing pain shot through Dionysus's chest, like a knife driven deep into his heart. Hera's cruel whispers grew louder, cutting through the woman's comforting voice. "You are nothing. You are cursed." Her words stung him, echoing in his mind, drowning out everything else. His body convulsed, and he gasped for air, clutching his chest as the pain intensified. The world spun around him, the trees blurring into streaks of color. His vision was clouded, his head heavy, as though a great weight had been placed upon him. His legs gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees, the cold earth pressing against his skin. The mortals, terrified by the sudden change in him, stepped back, unsure of what was happening. The woman, still kneeling before him, reached out once more, but her hand faltered when she saw the madness that filled Dionysus's eyes. He no longer appeared to be the same god who had danced with them in the villages, spreading joy and laughter. This was something else, a twisted, broken version of the being he had once been. With a final, agonized cry, Dionysus threw his head back and let out a scream that seemed to rip through the very air itself. The sound was raw, filled with the weight of years of pain, of rejection, of being torn between two worlds that never truly accepted him. The scream was not just his, it was the cry of every being who had ever felt lost, who had ever been pushed aside and cast into darkness. The mortals watched in stunned silence as the god before them writhed in torment, his body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. The ground seemed to shake beneath them, as though the earth itself were reacting to the chaos within him. They had seen death, they had seen suffering, but this was something else entirely. It was as though the very fabric of his being was being torn apart, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dionysus's cries began to fade, his body stilling. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind still clouded by the poison that Hera had planted deep within him. The mortals, trembling, slowly backed away, unsure whether to offer help or flee from the terror they had just witnessed. And as they disappeared into the distance, Dionysus remained on the ground, broken and alone. The maddening whispers of Hera still echoed in his ears, but now they were faint, like distant thunder, though the damage had already been done. His mind, once full of clarity and joy, now felt like a shattered mirror, fractured, distorted, and lost forever. He could still feel the pulse of the world around him, the trees, the earth, the sky, but they felt distant, unreachable. He was adrift, a god with no home, no peace, no place to belong. Hera had won, if only for a moment, leaving him to wander in the wake of her vengeance, lost in a world that no longer made sense. And yet, deep within him, there was a flicker, a small, fragile ember of hope that refused to die. Even in the depths of madness, Dionysus held on to the belief that one day, somehow, he would find his way back. the world felt like it was slipping through Dionysus's fingers once again. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared blankly at the horizon, where the earth met the sky in a blur of colors. He could barely remember when he had last felt the sun on his skin or the joy of laughter. His mind was a storm, turbulent, chaotic, and relentless. Hera's curse had stolen him from himself, leaving him a hollow echo of the god he once was. And yet, amid the fragments of his scattered thoughts, there was a flicker, a glimmer that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way out. Then, through the haze of his madness, she appeared. She was a figure of power, yet gentle, a presence that seemed to weave through the air like a soft breeze. Cybele, the Earth Mother, a goddess who could command the wildest forces of nature, yet whose touch was as tender as a mother's embrace. Her arrival was like a breath of fresh air, a soundless promise of healing. Dionysus, lost in the depths of his turmoil, couldn't comprehend who she was at first. But the warmth that radiated from her, the way she moved with such grace, made him feel something he had not felt in what seemed like an eternity: comfort. She knelt before him, her hands resting gently on his trembling shoulders. He could feel her strength, not in the forceful grip of a conqueror, but in the quiet, steady reassurance of someone who had seen suffering and still knew how to offer solace. Her touch was like the earth itself, firm, unyielding, but soft with understanding. "Let go," Cybele whispered, her voice the softest of melodies, a sound that cut through the chaos of his mind. Let go, and feel the world again. He wanted to scream, to lash out at her for daring to approach him in his broken state. But something in her presence softened the edges of his pain. His mind, fractured and worn from the madness, couldn't keep its resistance for long. Slowly, he allowed her words to seep into him, like a cool river flowing through the parched desert of his soul. It wasn't magic, not in the way he had known it. It was something deeper, more ancient, as if she was speaking to a part of him that had always been there, waiting to be heard. Her hands began to glow faintly, the warmth radiating from her like a beacon, drawing out the shadows that clung to him. He felt it first in his chest, a warmth, like the sun breaking through a clouded sky. The tightness, the crushing weight that had settled there since Hera's madness overtook him, began to loosen, just slightly at first. Then, a surge of relief flooded through him, a wave of clarity sweeping through the storm in his mind. He gasped, his breath catching as the haze around him began to lift. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could think clearly. The voices, those haunting, echoing whispers, began to fade into the background, no longer at the forefront of his mind. Cybele's presence anchored him, steadying him as the fragments of his thoughts slowly clicked back together. It was as though his very soul was being stitched back together, each thread placed with gentle precision, allowing him to feel whole again. Cybele's hands moved, still glowing with that soft, golden light. They cupped his face, lifting his gaze to meet hers. Her eyes were full of compassion, but there was something else there, too: strength, a quiet power that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was in her every movement, in the way she held him, steady and unwavering. "You are not lost," she said, her voice a balm to his tortured heart. "You are more than your madness. You are more than Hera's wrath. You are Dionysus, the god of freedom, of joy, of life itself. Do not forget that." Dionysus felt a shiver pass through him at her words. The weight of them settled in his chest, a comforting truth that washed over him like a river smoothing jagged stones. He was Dionysus. He had always been Dionysus, even when the storm raged in his mind, even when he had felt like nothing but a broken fragment of a god. He had never truly lost himself, he had only been hidden, buried beneath the pain and the poison of Hera's spite. The last remnants of madness ebbed away, leaving behind only a raw, tender awareness. He could feel the earth beneath him again, the solid, grounding presence of the world that he had once reveled in. He could hear the birds, the wind, the rustling of leaves. All the familiar sounds, once muffled by chaos, now rang clear in his ears. He could see the world with new eyes, the colors more vibrant, the air more fragrant, the very pulse of life alive around him. Cybele, still kneeling before him, smiled gently. Her eyes were soft, her gaze filled with an understanding that only someone who had known great pain and even greater healing could offer. "You have come home," she said simply. And he had. In that moment, Dionysus realized that he had never truly been lost. He had only needed time to heal, to rediscover the parts of himself that had been broken. And now, as the last vestiges of his madness dissipated, he could see the world with a clarity that felt almost like a second birth. He was free. He was whole. The weight of the past no longer pressed on him as it once had. The curse of Hera was still a part of him, but it no longer had a hold. The battle between his divine and mortal sides, which had once torn him apart, had found its balance. His identity, forged in the fires of torment and rebirth, was his to command. He had been both broken and healed, and now he stood ready to embrace his purpose fully. He looked at Cybele, the goddess who had restored him, with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, the words heavy with meaning. Cybele nodded, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "It was not I who healed you, but you who allowed yourself to heal. Remember that. You have the strength within you." With those words, the world seemed to shift. Dionysus's mind, now steady and clear, was full of possibilities. He could see the path before him, the journey that awaited. He had not come to the end of his story, but rather to the beginning of something new, a chapter where his true self could rise, unshackled by madness, unburdened by the past. And so, with Cybele's gentle blessing, Dionysus stood, a god reborn, with a heart full of clarity and a purpose that would carry him forward, toward the wild joy and freedom that he was destined to share with the world once more. It began with whispers in the shadows. First, it was just a murmur, a soft voice carried by the winds. Then, it spread like wildfire. A new energy, a new force had been born, and the world could feel it. Dionysus, the god of liberation and madness, had risen from the ashes of his past, and now he would call the world to his side. At first, it was only a handful of curious souls drawn to the joy in his eyes and the wildness in his spirit. They gathered in secret, near the mountains and the forests, away from the prying eyes of the gods who would disapprove. The earth seemed to welcome them, as though the soil itself recognized the energy of this new worship. It was not like the rigid rituals of the other gods, with their stone altars and solemn prayers. This was something different, something alive. The Maenads, women whose hearts were set ablaze by the god's presence, danced beneath the moonlit sky. Their feet barely touched the earth as they moved, their bodies twisting and swaying in perfect harmony with the winds, the trees, and the pulse of life around them. Their hair flew wild, and their eyes shone with an unearthly glow. In their hands, they held the symbols of Dionysus, the thyrsus, a staff wrapped in ivy and topped with a pine cone, a symbol of fertility and divine inspiration. It was said that those who danced in the wildness of his rites could feel the earth beneath them tremble with the beat of a god's heart. The satyrs, creatures of wild joy, played their flutes, their pipes filling the night air with music that felt like magic. The notes were pure ecstasy, the rhythm a call to abandon, a beckoning to throw away the chains of everyday life and to live in the moment, fully, wildly, and without restraint. Their laughter echoed through the trees, mixing with the sound of the Maenads' voices in a symphony of madness and freedom. And then came the humans. They were ordinary at first, farmers, herders, travelers, those who had nothing to lose, but everything to gain from the god who promised release from the weight of the world. They came in the night, following the trails of wine and music, finding their way to the sacred places where Dionysus's followers gathered. Their lives were ordinary, constrained by the grind of survival and the pressures of society. But with Dionysus, they found something else. They found joy. They drank the wine that flowed like rivers, that seemed to pulse with the very essence of life itself. It was not just a drink, it was a connection, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. They felt the warmth of the god's presence inside them, spreading like fire through their veins. In the revelry, in the celebration, they could forget their troubles, even if just for a moment. In that fleeting moment, they were gods, free from the weight of expectations and the shackles of reality. As the followers grew, so did their practices. The rites became more elaborate, the music more entrancing, the dances more frantic. The night was no longer just a time for rest, it became a time for rebirth, for letting go of the old and embracing the new. And through it all, Dionysus watched with a mix of pride and something deeper, a quiet sense of knowing. This was the world he had always wanted, a world where joy could be experienced without fear of consequence, where the heart could beat freely without being bound by the rules of society. The worship of Dionysus wasn't just about drunken revelry. It was about transformation, about crossing the boundaries between the human and the divine, between order and chaos. It was a ritual of shedding one's skin, of leaving behind the old self to be reborn, wild and free. For Dionysus's followers, the moments of abandon were the moments when they felt most alive, when they were closest to the truth of the world, when they touched the divine. The rituals were unpredictable, wild. One moment, there would be a circle of worshippers, hands raised to the sky, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the earth. The next, the group would erupt into a frenzy, losing themselves to the music, to the wine, to the spirit of the god. It was madness, but it was beautiful. It was life in its purest form, untamed, unrestrained, and powerful. Through these rites, the Maenads and Satyrs became the living embodiment of Dionysus's spirit. Their wildness was no longer just a characteristic, it was a form of worship. The men and women who followed him did not simply admire him from a distance, they became him. They carried his energy within them, and in doing so, they transformed not only themselves, but the very world around them. The cults began to spread, from village to village, from city to city. What had begun in secret, under the cover of night, was no longer hidden. People came to worship not only for the joy and the revelry, but for the healing, for the release of their burdens. Some came for the promise of ecstasy, others for the simple desire to be part of something greater than themselves. As Dionysus's influence grew, so too did the importance of his followers. They were not just worshippers, they were the keepers of his mysteries, the ones who understood the truth that no one else did. To be a part of the cult was to touch something beyond the ordinary world, something sacred and untouchable. The rituals became more refined, more sacred. Initiates went through rites of passage, learning the mysteries of the god, understanding the deeper meanings behind the wildness, the chaos, and the joy. The mysteries were not just about the wine or the dance, they were about the soul, the spirit, the moment of true liberation. But even as the cults flourished, not everyone understood. The other gods, jealous of Dionysus's growing power and influence, began to take notice. Hera, still burning with resentment, watched from afar, while the others remained skeptical of the new form of worship. But Dionysus didn't need their approval. His followers were his true strength, and together, they created something that no one could take away, a movement, a force of nature that couldn't be denied. In the sacred groves and in the temples, the spirit of Dionysus was alive. His name was whispered with reverence, his presence felt in every glass of wine, and every note of music, and every dance that stirred the air. He had become more than just a god, he had become a way of life. The rise of the Dionysian cults was not just the rise of a worship movement, it was the rise of a new way of being, a new way of understanding the world, of embracing both its wildness and its beauty. And in that wildness, there was freedom. In that freedom, there was life. The heavens trembled, a hushed murmur of expectancy filling the air as Dionysus made his way to Mount Olympus. It was a moment long awaited, a moment that seemed to pause time itself. His return was not like that of any other god, it was not a formal procession, nor a victory march. It was a quiet, almost serene ascent, yet it held a weight of history behind it, an undeniable recognition of a god who had walked a different path, one marked by joy, madness, and the wild pulse of life. The air around Olympus seemed to hum with anticipation. The gods, who had long watched from their high thrones, looked down upon him, some with curiosity, others with veiled disdain. For years, Dionysus had been the god of the fringes, his rites held in secret, his worship in the shadows, far from the rigid halls of Olympus. He had been the outsider, the unpredictable force that the other gods never fully understood. But now, he was stepping into their world, claiming his place among them. and the world, both mortal and divine, would never be the same again. As he approached the gates of Olympus, the earth seemed to open before him, offering passage to this god who had lived and breathed life in its most unrestrained form. The air grew thick with the sweet scent of wine, mingled with the sharp, invigorating bite of fresh air. The sky above glistened, as if acknowledging his arrival, and in the distance, the great mount itself seemed to shimmer, the clouds parting to allow him entry. Zeus stood at the gates of the divine realm, his eyes warm with pride. His son, his wild and brilliant child, had finally come to take his place among the gods. There was a tenderness in Zeus's gaze, something only a father could show, despite the many battles and challenges that had come with Dionysus's existence. He had always known that his son was different, a god of chaos and creation in one breath, and in that difference, he held a power no other god could ever possess. "Welcome home, my son," Zeus said, his voice carrying across the heavens, reaching into the hearts of all who stood nearby. The Olympian gods watched silently, their faces betraying mixed emotions. Some looked on with quiet admiration for the god who had so thoroughly transformed the mortal world. Others, like Hera, could barely hide the resentment that still festered within her heart. For all her strength, for all her pride as the queen of the gods, she had never forgiven Dionysus's existence, and the weight of that unspoken anger lay heavy in the air. Dionysus looked up at his father, the man who had given him life, yet had never fully understood him. There was love in his eyes, but also a weariness. Years of wandering, of being cast aside, had left their mark. He had lived among mortals, and through them, he had learned to embrace both the joy and the sorrow of life. Now, returning to Olympus, he was not just a god, but a reflection of the very force of nature that tied all things together. He had come to show them that the divine and mortal realms were not separate, they were intertwined in a dance that neither side could ever fully control. Hera stood beside Zeus, her lips pressed tightly together. She did not speak, but her presence was undeniable. There was a tension in the air, as though the very earth held its breath. It was not that Hera feared Dionysus, no, she was far beyond such emotions. But she could not shake the bitter taste of defeat, the quiet rage that simmered within her. To her, Dionysus was a living reminder of her own pain, the child of an affair that had defied her wrath, the symbol of Zeus's defiance. She had watched his rise from the shadows, each step a reminder of her inability to erase him from existence. As Dionysus stood before the gods, he felt the weight of her gaze. He could feel the coldness, the unspoken judgment, and yet, he did not flinch. His time in the mortal world had taught him that nothing was truly certain. Life was a fleeting moment of joy and chaos, and all gods, even the mighty Hera, were part of the same fragile tapestry. Zeus turned toward his queen, his gaze firm but understanding. "Hera," he said, his voice rich with a depth that reached into her heart, "this is our son. He has come to claim his place among us." Hera's eyes met his, her lips pressed in a tight line. She said nothing for a long moment, the weight of her bitterness clouding her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice colder than the winds that swept across the mountaintops. "So be it," she murmured, though it was clear that she would never fully accept the god who stood before her. Dionysus, for his part, did not seek her approval. He had never been the kind of god to demand respect, but he had earned it in his own way. His presence, his power, was undeniable. He did not need Hera's blessing to exist, nor did he need to bend to her will. He was a god of joy, of wine, of the madness that could break through the hardest of hearts. And in his eyes, Olympus had no choice but to accept him, because he had always been part of its world, just as much as any other god. With a final glance at Hera, he turned his eyes to the others, Athena, Artemis, Apollo, Poseidon, and the many others who stood in silence, watching his every move. They were silent, unsure of how to react. Dionysus had never been part of their world, but they could not deny that something powerful had come to Olympus. It was not just his connection to his father, nor his place in the divine hierarchy. It was something deeper. Something elemental. Zeus stepped forward, his arm raised, and a thunderous cheer echoed through the halls of Olympus. Dionysus's place among the gods was no longer in question. He was a god of both the heavens and the earth, a bridge between the divine and the mortal, a reminder that life was not just to be lived in the halls of Olympus, but also in the wild, untamed corners of the world. Dionysus stood tall, his heart full of both love and defiance. He had come home, not to be just another god on Olympus, but to bring something new, something needed. In his madness, his revelry, his laughter, and his tears, he would carve out a place for himself in this world, a world where joy and sorrow walked hand in hand. And as the gods looked upon him, they knew, whether they acknowledged it or not, that Olympus would never be the same again. Dionysus stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing down at the world below. The sky, painted in hues of deep orange and purple, mirrored the complexity within him. He was both the flame and the smoke, the sweet nectar and the bitter sorrow, the wild joy and the terrifying madness. Every step he had taken, every choice he had made, had been shaped by this dual nature, two forces constantly fighting for control, yet inseparable. His followers gathered below, their faces twisted with ecstasy as they danced and shouted in a frenzy. The Maenads, their hair wild, their bodies moving to a rhythm only they could hear, were lost in a world where pleasure and pain were indistinguishable. Satyrs pranced alongside them, their laughter mixing with the music, the air thick with wine and heat. In this moment, they were both free and captive, freed from the constraints of the ordinary world, yet consumed by the very force that had set them loose. Dionysus's heart swelled with a strange feeling. He had given them this freedom, this escape from the mundane. Yet, somewhere in the depths of his being, he knew that this same joy could lead them to madness, and madness could lead to destruction. The very ecstasy that filled the air was a breath away from chaos. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the other gods, Zeus, Hera, Demeter, and all the others who had shaped him. His birth had been surrounded by turmoil, his existence a clash of opposing forces. He was both mortal and divine, both life and death. Even now, in the grandeur of Olympus, the gods were often unsure of him, unable to fully understand the complexities of his nature. They had seen his power, his revelry, his madness. But they had never understood that he was not just one thing. He was not just joy, not just wine, not just madness. He was all of it, together. "Why do you seem so distant, Dionysus?" a voice broke through his thoughts. Hermes appeared beside him, his eyes gleaming with mischief but softened by a deep understanding. He had always been one of the few gods who truly grasped Dionysus's nature, the god of communication, the messenger, the guide. He had seen the contradiction that lived in Dionysus, and he didn't judge it. Dionysus turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You know me too well, Hermes. How can I not feel the pull of both worlds?" His voice was filled with a mixture of weariness and acceptance, as though he had long since come to terms with the tug of two opposing forces inside him. Hermes chuckled softly. "You are both the life of the party and the one who causes the storm." He tilted his head, considering Dionysus with a thoughtful expression. "It's not easy, is it? Carrying that weight, being both creation and destruction." Dionysus's gaze shifted back to his followers below. The music was reaching a crescendo, the dance becoming more frenzied. His heart beat in rhythm with the pounding drums, the wild rhythm of their movements. But there was something more, something darker, in the way the wine flowed, the way their joy teetered on the edge of madness. He could feel it, could see it in their eyes, the dangerous pull that threatened to swallow them whole. "It never is," Dionysus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant cries of his followers. "But it's the only way I know how to be." Hermes regarded him with a mixture of affection and understanding. "You're not alone in that. The gods are no different. We all have our contradictions, our shadows. But you," he paused, looking out over the scene before them, "you carry them more openly than anyone. You wear your madness like a crown, and your joy like a cloak." Dionysus smiled again, but it was a bittersweet expression, tinged with something darker. "I am both God and mortal," he whispered. "In one breath, I bring life, in the next, I bring death. My followers don't always see that. They only see the ecstasy, the wine, the dance. He clenched his fist. But they don't see the cost. They don't see the madness that comes with it, the destruction that follows when the frenzy ends. Is it worth it? Hermes asked, genuinely curious. Dionysus looked back at him, eyes filled with a strange depth. I don't know. But it's who I am. And who they are, too. He gestured down to the dancing throng below. They may not know it, but they carry it inside them, too. They seek release, they seek freedom, but they don't understand that they're also seeking destruction. When you break free, something always breaks with you. The air seemed to grow heavier as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging between them. He could see it, too, the way his followers danced and laughed, oblivious to the danger, caught up in the intoxication of the moment. They were not just celebrating life, they were courting death, too. Every step they took was both an affirmation of life and a defiance of the world's rules. And in that defiance, there was something beautiful and terrifying. Hermes' expression softened. You give them the freedom they seek, Dionysus. You show them that life is not about rules or restraint. It's about embracing all that we are, even the darkness. But it's hard. And I can see it's wearing on you. Dionysus's gaze grew distant. He had seen the faces of mortals, both joyful and terrified, during the height of his celebrations. He had seen them drunk on wine, yes, but also drunk on life, on chaos, on the fearlessness that came with losing control. And yet, in those moments, he had also seen something else, a fleeting sense of liberation, an escape from the struggles of their ordinary lives. They came to him to find release, and he gave it to them, freely, with open arms. But it was never without consequence. Maybe I'm not meant to understand it all, Dionysus admitted softly. Maybe it's enough just to live it, to let them live it. You don't have to understand it all, Hermes replied, his tone warm. That's the beauty of it. You are not just a god of madness. You are also a god of release. And that's what makes you, you. Dionysus turned to him, a small spark of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Hermes. Maybe you're right. I don't need to understand it all. I just need to keep living it. Keep offering them that moment of freedom. And as the night wore on, as the sound of music and laughter echoed through the hills, Dionysus knew that the cycle would continue. The ecstasy and the madness, the life and the death, would always be intertwined. And in that dance, in that fragile balance, he would continue to exist, not as one thing, but as both. Dionysus sat alone on a stone bench beneath the towering oak tree at the edge of the mountain. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant echo of the world below. For so long, he had searched for meaning in his existence, a purpose that could explain the chaos, the madness, and the fleeting joy he brought. The other gods were always so certain of their roles. Zeus ruled the heavens with a mighty hand, Hera protected the sacred bonds of marriage, Poseidon commanded the seas with the flick of his trident. But what was his purpose? What role did he, the god of ecstasy and madness, play in a world that sought order and control? He had always been an outsider, even on Mount Olympus. His laughter, his revelry, his willingness to embrace both the beauty and the darkness of life, these things set him apart. He wasn't like the others, and that had always made him feel disconnected. As the day wore on, the sound of distant music carried up the mountain, faint but clear. It was the song of his followers, the Maenads, the Satyrs, and all who sought the wild freedom that only he could offer. They were out there, lost in their dances, their frenzy, their joy. He had given them that moment of release, that catharsis. But was it enough? Was it truly what the world needed? His mind wandered to his role among the gods, to the way he had been welcomed, or, rather, how he had not been. He was the god who brought chaos, who tore away the walls that people built around themselves, only to leave them vulnerable in the aftermath. In many ways, his power was dangerous. It was the rawness of life laid bare, without the mask of control. And yet, wasn't there a kind of purity in that? A truth? A soft rustle from behind pulled him from his thoughts. Hermes appeared, as usual, with his mischievous grin and quick wit. "You look far away, my friend. Have you found your place among the gods yet, or are you still trying to figure it out?" Dionysus smiled faintly, the weight of his uncertainties pressing against his chest. "I don't think there's one place for me, Hermes. I'm not like the others. I don't bring order. I bring release. I show them the beauty in surrender, the grace in madness. But it's not the same as ruling the skies or the seas, is it?" Hermes sat beside him, crossing his legs with casual ease. "No, it's not the same. But maybe that's the point. Maybe you're not meant to control. Maybe you're meant to remind them that life isn't all about control. That sometimes they need to lose themselves to truly find themselves." Dionysus looked out at the horizon, his thoughts drifting. "I see them, my followers. When they dance, when they drink, when they lose themselves in the music, they are free. They are fully alive. But it's fleeting, Hermes. The moment always passes, and when it does, they're left with nothing but emptiness. I show them the way to freedom, but I can't make them stay there. I can't make it last." "You don't have to," Hermes said quietly. "You give them what they need in that moment. The rest is up to them. You're the bridge, Dionysus. The bridge between the gods and the mortals, between the heavens and the earth. You show them that there's more to life than the rules, the order. You show them that there's beauty in chaos and surrender. You show them what it means to truly live." Dionysus turned to him, a flicker of realization beginning to stir within him. "So, that's it. I'm not here to rule. I'm here to remind them that they are more than the boxes they try to put themselves in. That they are allowed to feel deeply, to break free, to embrace both their joy and their pain. That's my purpose." "Exactly," Hermes said, his eyes twinkling with approval. "You bring release. You help them connect with something larger than themselves. You are the wild and untamed part of life, the part that makes it worth living. Without you, life would be too controlled, too safe. And what's the point of that?" Dionysus nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, he could see the purpose in his existence. It wasn't about reigning over others or keeping the world in balance like the other gods. It was about showing mortals what it meant to be fully alive. To break free from their fears, their doubts, their expectations, and just be. To experience life in its raw, unfiltered form. And in doing so, to reconnect with the divine. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land, Dionysus rose to his feet, his body charged with newfound clarity. He could hear the music growing louder now, the call of his followers, the pull of the revelry. It was time. Time to remind them of their freedom, time to show them the way again. He was a god of release, yes. But more than that, he was a god of catharsis. A god who bridged the divine and the mortal, offering a fleeting glimpse into the divine through the madness of the dance, the euphoria of the wine, the joy of surrender. His purpose wasn't to control or to dominate, it was to remind them of the sacredness in the chaos. The beauty in the letting go. As he descended the mountain, Hermes walking beside him, Dionysus felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place, not among the rulers of Olympus, but as a bridge between the realms. And as long as there were mortals who sought release, who needed to feel the pulse of life in their veins, he would be there, offering them that moment of connection, of freedom, of joy. The rest, as Hermes had said, was up to them. The music grew louder, and the world below seemed to wait for him, ready for the next chapter of the dance. The air hummed with anticipation as the people of the city gathered, their faces alive with excitement and fervor. The streets were adorned with flowers, their vivid colors weaving through the crowds like threads in a great tapestry. The scent of wine hung in the air, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed through the city, signaling the arrival of something powerful, something sacred. It was the festival of Dionysus, the god who had touched the hearts of both mortals and gods alike, and the city was alive in his honor. The high priest stood at the center of the procession, his robes flowing behind him as he held aloft the sacred thyrsus, the staff wrapped with ivy and crowned with a pine cone. The crowd cheered, their voices rising like a wave as they followed in his footsteps, their hearts lifted in unity and celebration. This was the moment when the boundaries between the gods and humans seemed to vanish, when the divine presence of Dionysus filled the air, and the people felt his touch in every beat of the drum, every sip of wine, and every dance that carried them into a world beyond the ordinary. In the midst of the revelry, there were flashes of the past, whispers of a time when Dionysus had wandered the earth, a god both wild and serene, offering the gift of release and ecstasy to those who followed him. The legacy of his journeys, of his trials and triumphs, lived on in the hearts of the worshippers who gathered year after year to honor him. The Maenads, with their wild eyes and untamed spirits, danced through the streets, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the music, lost in the intoxicating joy of the moment. Satyrs joined in, their laughter echoing through the air as they leapt and spun, their playful antics a reflection of the freedom Dionysus had once gifted them. And in the middle of it all, the wine flowed, deep red and sweet, poured into golden goblets, offered freely to all who sought it. Each drop seemed to carry the god's blessing, a reminder of his enduring presence in the world. The Bacchanalia, the great celebration in Dionysus's name, was a thing of legend. It was a time when the ordinary rules of life were set aside, when even the humblest of people could experience the divine through the sacred rites of the god of ecstasy. The lines between class and station blurred in those wild nights, and in their place, a shared experience of joy and madness took hold. Those who had never known freedom danced with those who had known only the harshness of life. The music was not just a melody but a pulse that resonated deep within the hearts of every participant, urging them to let go, to shed the weight of their burdens, and to embrace the wild, untamed spirit that Dionysus had come to symbolize. At the height of the festival, the temple to Dionysus glowed with the light of 1,000 torches. The people knelt in reverence, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames as they offered prayers to the god who had taught them the value of release. The high priest chanted the ancient words, calling upon Dionysus to bless them with his presence once more, to remind them of the wild beauty in life's fleeting moments. The air was thick with devotion, with a collective longing to feel the touch of the god's spirit once again. And then, as if in answer, a great cheer rose from the crowd. The image of Dionysus, borne on a grand chariot, was carried into the heart of the city. His eyes, wild and knowing, gazed out over the crowd, and his presence seemed to stretch across the horizon. For just a moment, it was as if the god himself had stepped into the world of mortals once more, offering his blessing to all who gathered to honor him. The people sang, their voices rising in unison, and the earth seemed to respond. The ground beneath their feet thrummed with life, as if the very soil rejoiced in the union between heaven and earth that Dionysus's worship had forged. The god of wine, of madness, of joy, and sorrow, he had become a bridge between the divine and the mortal, a link that bound the two realms in a shared celebration of the cycles of life. The legacy of Dionysus was not one of rule or power. It was not one of conquest or war. His legacy was the freedom he had given, the catharsis he had offered, the release from the weight of the world. He had shown mortals that they were more than their fears, their duties, and their constraints. He had taught them to embrace the fullness of their being, to let go of control, and to surrender to the beauty of the present moment. As the night stretched on, the music grew louder, the dancing more wild. The streets seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the earth, and Dionysus was there, in every movement, in every song, in every drop of wine. His legacy lived on in the joy of the people, in the laughter that rang out under the moonlit sky, and the dances that blurred the line between the sacred and the earthly. Dionysus had left his mark on the world in ways that no one, not even the gods, could deny. His festivals had become an essential part of Greek culture, a time of renewal, a time when the people could forget their struggles and reconnect with the wild, untamed energy that flowed through them all. His cults had spread across the land, from the highest mountain to the lowest valley, from the grandest city to the humblest village. The god who had once wandered the earth, searching for his place, had found it, right here, in the hearts of those who celebrated his name. His legacy was not one of power or domination, but of liberation. He had shown the world that even in the darkest moments, there was a spark of joy, a flicker of light that could bring people together. Through the wild dances, the intoxicating music, and the shared experience of release, Dionysus had united gods and mortals alike in a timeless celebration of life. As the festivities carried on into the night, the people knew, whether they spoke it aloud or not, that Dionysus was there, watching over them, a god who would never be forgotten, his legacy forever entwined with the spirit of the earth, the spirit of freedom, and the spirit of life itself. There are moments in life when the world seems to pause, when time stretches and holds its breath, and you feel the pulse of something greater than yourself, something eternal, something that has always been. It's in these fleeting moments, in the quiet of dawn or the wild abandon of a midnight dance, that the spirit of Dionysus lingers. His presence isn't just a whisper of the past, a relic of ancient times. It's alive, breathing through every celebration, every burst of joy, every act of surrender. It doesn't matter that centuries have passed since the first festivals were held in his honor, since the first chorus of ecstatic voices filled the air. The essence of Dionysus remains woven into the fabric of life itself, running through the veins of those who dare to live fully, without hesitation, without fear. The god of rebirth, the god of ecstasy, the god of freedom, his influence endures, shifting and changing, but never fading. On the surface, life goes on. People wake, work, struggle, and strive. Yet in the undercurrent of human existence, in the places where joy and pain meet, where the weight of the world gives way to lightness, Dionysus waits. He is there in the laughter that rises unexpectedly, in the moments of pure abandon when music carries you beyond yourself, and the spark of connection that happens when two souls meet, freed from the burdens of their daily lives. Dionysus's gift, the gift of release, is ever present, like the moment when the first sip of wine touches your lips and the world softens, when the rhythm of drums quickens your heartbeat and the body moves before the mind can catch up. In those moments, Dionysus is reborn. His spirit is everywhere, in every joyous dance, in every wild celebration, in every rebirth that happens when people find their freedom. Even the harshest of winters gives way to spring. The fields, once barren, bloom again, and life returns in vibrant colors. Just as Dionysus was reborn from his mother's body, so too is there a rebirth in the world around us. The god's essence is not bound by the constraints of time or space. He exists in every season of life. When the days feel darkest, when hope seems a distant dream, Dionysus reminds us that there is always renewal, always a way to rise again. Look around, and you'll find echoes of his influence in the world today. The festivals may not always be grand or dramatic, but they are there, in the way people gather to celebrate life, to celebrate each other, in the quiet joy of shared meals, in the music that unites, in the dances that sweep away cares. Dionysus lives in these moments, and he lives in the hearts of those who know how to celebrate, to release, to surrender to the beauty of the present. There are those who keep his spirit alive in rituals of music and dance, in the revelry of life. The world may have changed in many ways, but deep inside, the call of Dionysus remains unchanged. His power is not in control but in liberation, in the freedom to step outside the rules, to break free from the chains that bind. It is in the joy of the unknown, the beauty of letting go. Every time someone lets go of their fears, every time they step into the wild unknown, Dionysus is there, his spirit ever watchful, ever present. His legacy is not just in the temples built to honor him, not just in the festivals that once echoed through ancient cities. It lives in every soul who dares to embrace the untamed parts of themselves, and every person who dances when the music calls, who lets go when the weight of the world becomes too much to bear. Dionysus, the twice-born god, reminds us that there is beauty in the chaos, that joy can be found even in the darkest corners of life. And what of the broken-hearted, the lost, the weary? Dionysus offers them his gift, too, the gift of healing through release. He gives them the chance to dance through their pain, to drink from the cup of renewal, to find, in their most vulnerable moments, a sense of freedom that cannot be taken away. He is the God who takes the broken pieces and makes them whole again, who turns grief into ecstasy, who turns suffering into release. The spirit of Dionysus is not just an ancient story but a living, breathing force in the world today. His presence is there in the festival crowd, in the quiet moments when you let go and feel the world around you with a sense of wonder. He is in the wild joy of life and the bittersweet moments of letting go. The twice-born God, the God of the wild, the God of renewal, he continues to teach, to heal, to remind us that freedom is not found in control, but in surrender. So, as the seasons change, as the world moves forward, Dionysus' spirit remains undimmed. He is there in every burst of laughter, in every tear shed in joy, and every moment of release. His legacy is in the dance, in the music, in the wine, in the lives of those who choose to live fully. He is the God who reminds us that life is fleeting, but the joy that comes from truly living it is eternal. In every act of rebirth, in every celebration, in every release, Dionysus lives. His spirit is eternal, and it flows through us all, reminding us that in the face of death, there is always life, in the midst of sorrow, there is always joy, and in the chaos of life, there is always a way to be free.